Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world. Joining us today from New York City, Bobby Ghosh of Bloomberg Opinion. Bobby, great to have you again. And from London, Gideon Rachman, who is the chief foreign affairs correspondent, columnist, and commentator for the Financial Times. Gideon, great to have you. And from Washington, D.C., Susan Glasser, staff writer of The New Yorker. Susan, wonderful to have you back.
Thank you so much, Ivo. Great to be with you.
Bobby, let's start with you. Lots of things happening, particularly in sort of the middle part of the world, the Middle East, which is, I think, where we're going to concentrate most of our conversation today. Most immediately, the coup or non-coup or whatever you want to describe it in Tunisia, a country that started the Arab Spring and it looks like may now finally show the end of the Arab Spring. What happened in Tunisia and why is this so important?
Well, I'd certainly call it, if it's not a coup, it's certainly a power grab with very strong coup-like tendencies. What's happened is that the president, Kais Saied, has made the power grab. He has dismissed parliament. He has fired the prime minister. He has invoked a fairly obscure and fuzzy aspect of the constitution to take all executive power, which he seems to be sharing to some degree with the military. So, you know, if it smells like a coup and it sounds like a coup, then it probably is one. Certainly the opposition, the elected members of parliament, many of them, are calling it a coup. The Biden administration is playing a little coy with the terminology, but it is a very dangerous moment and probably the biggest challenge, to my mind, for Tunisian democracy since 2011, when I had the good fortune of covering the Arab Spring when it first broke out there. To remind ourselves, that's where the Arab Spring began, and for most of the past decade, Tunisia has been the only Arab country or only country that participated in the Arab Spring where democracy seemed to have taken root. It is now being challenged, and what happens in the next few weeks will be crucial, whether the same forces that made the Arab Spring possible, which is to say street protesters, the military, and the civil society institutions, the labor unions most prominently, whether they step up now to rescue the democracy that they made possible. That's what I'll be looking out for.
Gideon, if you know, in some ways, the Arab Spring was really the Tunis Spring. It happened in Tunis. It started there. It was the only place where it truly seemed to work. A democracy of some sort, a vibrant civil society emerged. But the underlying problem of the economic situation, the continued indebtedness of Tunisia to foreign debtors, continue to be fundamentally part of the situation there. How much, in fact, did change in the last 10 years? And how do you think that change might augur for answering Bobby's question about the future, the likelihood that some form of democracy, or at least liberty and liberalism, might survive the latest political upheaval there?
Well, I have to say, I mean, you know, it's in a way a banal thing to say, but having visited Tunisia, I mean, I really hope it does, because although, as you say, Tunisia had deep problems, it was kind of a refreshing place to visit in the Middle East. You know, Tunis itself has become a kind of refuge for a lot of people from all over the region. You would meet Libyan exiles, Egyptian exiles. There was a sort of vibrant civil society. And I think one of the things to watch out for now is what happens with the Muslim Brotherhood, or the sort of Tunisian version of it, Ennahda, which is a big political force in Tunisia. And obviously it's been stamped out in Egypt and around the region, but had, albeit with some difficulty, been incorporated into the sort of Tunisian political scene, seemed to be a more moderate version, you know, a version that was prepared to accept democracy. Whether they now go for this sort of complete clampdown on any form of political Islam is something to watch out for. But I think that, as you say, the economic problems were still very deep and unresolved. But what appears, it's a while since I've been to have really exacerbated the situation is COVID-19, where they've got a terrible pandemic. A lot of people, the healthcare system is buckling. Lockdowns have led to massive economic damage, and Tunisia was a very tourist-dependent economy. That was one of the big sources of foreign exchange. So there, for a society and an economy that was already quite fragile, this might have been the coup de grace, unfortunately. And there were there's a lot of unrest earlier in the year because connected to economic discontent.
Susan, strikes me this is one of the bigger challenges for the Biden administration in some ways. On the one hand, an administration that wants to reduce its involvement in the Middle East, and on the other hand, an administration that is putting values and democracy really at the forefront of at least its public posture, now challenged in this way. By the way, of course, the Arab Spring happened during the Obama presidency, when then Vice President Biden was a big force for the push of democracy. How is the administration handling this early, really quite unexpected turn of events in a very negative way? How are they talking about it, and what are they trying to do about it?
Well, to be blunt, Ivo, I think the answer is that they're not. And that reflects an administration that really has been very focused on domestic crises, of which there are many. And of course, we have had just this week the escalating spike in coronavirus cases, which is really causing a renewed sense of deep concern in the administration that almost everything is at risk if they don't get this latest fourth wave under control here in the United States. So, in general, it was already an administration that when it came to foreign policy was signaling a much more restrained view of the world, especially in terms of projection of power in the Middle East. And, Bobby had a really excellent column this week that focused on, sort of the echoes of what happened in Egypt with the sort of coup really there that toppled the Muslim Brotherhood government that brought Sisi to power. This is in some ways one of the most authoritarian states to have emerged in the rubble of the failed promise of the Arab Spring. And to see that echo, I was thinking, as we were talking about it already, of the sort of angels dancing on the head of a pin debates that happened in the Obama administration over what you could even call what played out in Egypt a coup or not a coup. And of course, now you see that sort of echo in what's happening in Tunisia right now. Is a coup? Is it not a coup? Well, the bottom line is it ain't a democracy, and it isn't also the first time, even in this very new Biden administration, it's not even the first time that we've seen a kind of wave of street protests followed by crackdowns or an end of democracy. Look at Myanmar, look at Cuba. These are, I think, a powerful wave of, unrest and disruption happening across the globe. Much of it, as Gideon pointed out, fueled by instability that comes from COVID-19 crisis in countries that are not well set up, either economically or governance-wise or public health-wise, and generally all of the above, to handle it. And that is fueling clearly a pretty widespread wave of global disruption right now. So I don't see the Biden administration, frankly, as doing much about it. They've talked about vaccine diplomacy. They have started to engage it to a certain extent, but in reality, the crisis here inside the United States is overwhelming. And I know we'll talk later about what that means about the other things. They can hardly focus on the countries in the Middle East where there has been an intensive U.S. focus in recent years. And I'll just throw one other crisis on the table there that they haven't done much about, even though that also really gets at even more traditional U.S. interests in the region. And that's Lebanon. Just a couple of weeks ago here in Washington, we had the French foreign minister, and I was doing an interview with him on stage at an event. And, at the end, I said something like, well, what are you going to bring up with the folks in the Biden administration in your meetings? And he was meeting with the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, and he said, basically, I'm here to make a personal plea, among all the other things, for Lebanon, which, of course, is historically a country of great interest to France, but also to the United States and a key sort of hinge state in the region. It's absolutely, literally collapsed. And frankly, I haven't heard word one from the White House about that. I understand why, but there's not a policy in the end toward Tunisia.
I think Susan lays out a pretty strong indictment. I see a column coming out of it. But Bobby, you could make exactly the same case about all the other countries that should be involved, and by the way, are closer geographically and in some ways economically and even demographically. A country like France, a country of much of the European Union, we haven't seen much from them either. And when it comes to the kind of rhetoric which we hear with regard to Tunisia, or indeed how to deal with the Arab Spring, this moment of hope seems to have been truly a moment and been lost. And yet you would think that not only the United States, but the Western European countries in particular would try to figure out a way to stabilize and help these countries and the people in those countries, and yet it hasn't happened. What do you? I know you're in New York right now, but what do you see from the Europeans on this entire situation?
Well, not enough, actually. It's interesting, Susan mentioned that the French foreign minister brought it up in discussions, brought up Beirut and Lebanon in discussions. There's been very little discussion on in the French media, as far that, to the extent that I've been monitoring it, about Tunisia. And the French government, although despite having strong historic colonial ties with Tunisia, doesn't seem to want to get involved with any degree. Europe is far and away Tunisia's largest, most important trading partner. Europeans have significant weight in Tunisian affairs and significant leverage with any government in Tunisia, and should be leaning much more forward. In the absence of the West, other people will get involved. So there is already indications that the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, which historically are very much opposed to Islamist, political Islam, and groups like the Muslim Brotherhood and Nahda, which is the Tunisian equivalent of it, they are cheering on the president in his power grab. And on the other hand, we're waiting to see what the countries that are in favor of the Muslim Brotherhood, so countries like Turkey and Qatar, what they're going to do. Very likely, they will want a say in what the next evolution, the next iteration of the crisis in Tunisia. So if the West doesn't get involved, other people will, and not necessarily in the most constructive ways. And I really worry about that.
Gideon, you are in Europe. What are you hearing anything, or is the silence deafening? And indeed, I think as Bobby said, providing an opening for the kind of proxy conflict that we have seen in Libya with Turkey on one side and Egypt, UAE, and Saudi on the other side. We see that conflict and Qatar and Turkey rightly sort of emerging as a dominant theme in much of the Middle East, and yet, no one seems to be either concerned about it or worried about it enough to do anything.
Yeah, well, I'm in London actually, which is now officially no longer part of Europe. But
well, maybe not of the European Union, but you're still geographically part of Europe.
I'm semi-kidding, but the British, which used to be, quite concerned with the Middle East, it's barely registered here what's happened in Tunisia. I mean, okay, North Africa was more of a sort of French zone of influence, but nonetheless, you know, the British and the French and the Americans all intervened in Libya in 2011. And I think Obama was fair enough when he said, you know, rather mildly, actually, under the circumstances, that he felt that the British had kind of lost interest in Libya after the overthrow of Gaddafi and washed their hands of it. And I think that is the case. You know, the British foreign policy, insofar as it exists, is still trying to kind of carve out some theoretical idea of global Britain, more focused on Asia, really not on the Middle East. The French, I think, you know, are trying a bit. They at least, you know, if you read the foreign pages of the French papers, they're still concerned with the Middle East, although, you know, I'll take Bobby's word for it that on Tunisia, they've been a bit quiet. But, you know, Macron has visited Tunisia, he's visited Lebanon, he's engaged with counterterrorism in Mali and so on, although the French have cut back a bit there. So I think they believe that they have a stabilization role to play. But France is, you know, like America maybe, has a huge amount of other stuff on its plate, including very turbulent domestic politics, a presidential election, you know, less than a year away, economic worries, COVID worries. And I think they feel a bit isolated within the European Union. They're one of the few countries that does try to kind of fashion a European view of its near neighborhood and of a European global role. But you know, the Eastern Europeans are preoccupied above all with Russia. The Germans, you know, are very non-interventionist for their own reasons. The Italians have their own particular take on Libya, but, you know, Tunisia is maybe a bridge too far. So the French would like to do something, but they, you know, just as I suppose the Americans can complain they're not getting much European support, the French would probably say, well, within the EU, they're a bit on their own.
Susan, let's move a little further east. We had the President of the United States standing with the Iraqi Prime Minister declaring the coming end to combat operations in Iraq. I remember 18 years ago, a president landing on an aircraft carrier and saying mission accomplished. We've kind of been here a number of times before. You think this time really is the end of the military combat involvement of the United States in Iraq?
Well, Ivo, look, you're right to say we've been ending it over and over and over again. It kind of reminds me of my time in Moscow when every time, this was more than a decade after the end of the Cold War, and every time an American president would come to visit Moscow and Vladimir Putin, they would say, and this was in the early years, they would say, this is the end of, this is really the end of the Cold War. This is really the end of the Cold War. And, you know, there's something like that happening now, right? This is really the end of the Iraq War. You know, I was there for the very beginning of the Iraq War. I was an unembedded reporter for the Washington Post, which meant my job was to drive a rental car from the Kuwait City Airport across the line. We managed to do so. Remember, they began the combat operations there actually a day before they were expected to. We ended up driving across, finding some very helpful British sappers who thought we were probably American other government agency, as you say, let us drive across their sand berm. We made it into Iraq at literally the very day this began. And then we decided it wasn't safe. And we turned around and we drove our rental cars right back into Kuwait for about a week or so. It's extraordinary. It's extraordinary that, you know, we're still talking about this now, is the truth. I think that the Biden administration and Biden personally is haunted by the sort of failed withdrawal and end to combat operations that he oversaw. He was handed the Iraq portfolio by President Obama. At the time, Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State. And as you know, they were negotiating for a longer term US presence there. Those talks broke down, and essentially the Iraqis and the Americans said, fine, well, we're leaving. And of course, the disastrous and really catastrophic for not just Iraq, but for the region rise of ISIS occurred, including at one point a drive so swift across the region that they came very close to threatening Baghdad itself. And so I think that memory haunts the US military, haunts Joe Biden personally, and is why you're seeing a somewhat different approach to Iraq than you are to Afghanistan right now. A lot of this is essentially symbolism. Many have written it's political theater. I agree with that. I think you don't see as much discussion about Iraq right now as you do Afghanistan here in Washington, for reasons that we'll talk about, I'm sure. But when it comes to Iraq, I think the other thing that's key for people to understand is the extent to which it factors into the still very unclear Biden administration plans for how they're going to deal with both Iran and also with Syria, where despite years of bluster on the part of Donald Trump, essentially a small contingent of, just under 1,000 U.S. troops does remain. And Iraq has remained also a key strategic location for the United States in the region. And when that airstrike on Qasem Soleimani that assassinated him occurred in January of 2020, that was launched from base inside Iraq itself. So I think the U.S. has a very strong interest in remaining on good political terms with the leadership in Iraq, which is not something that's easy to do given the sort of dominant regional pressure that comes on any Iraqi government from the Iranians next door. So I'll leave it at that. We can talk about it more, but I think that very few people were kind of sucked in by the kind of surround sound and symbolism of that Iraq declaration this week, the meeting in the Oval Office with President Biden. This wasn't really front page news here in the United States. Again, I know I'm like a broken record, but this is an inward looking time here. And even those of us who think it's really urgent to talk about the US and its intersection with the rest of the world, it's shouting into the wind of multiple interlocking crises that we do not yet have a handle on here in the United States.
I should add, Susan, to the people who were truly affected by what happened in 2010, 2011 is the current Secretary of Defense, who was the four-star commander of U.S. forces, General Austin, now Secretary Austin. And in fact, the bond forged with Biden at that time led to Biden insisting on, repeatedly insisting on Austin as his Secretary of Defense. So Iraq plays a big part in Biden's own personal history. Of course, his son served under the command of General Austin and later succumbed to brain cancer. So there is a very big personal connectivity here. But the larger piece, Bobby, that Susan also pointed out is that you may be able to walk away from Afghanistan, and we'll come to that in a minute, but walking away from Iraq is a really tough thing to do, not only because of the history, but because of Iran. Because, we may have defeated Saddam Hussein, but it was pretty darn clear that the Iranians are the big winner and have been the big winner from that war. And we've been trying to figure out a way to push back Iranian influence in Iraq. You know this region well. How do you see this playing out? And what was the reaction in Tehran to the kind of announcement of withdrawing or at least lessening U.S. involvement in Iraq?
Well, I think the whole thing was very performative, and the responses both from within Iraq and the Iraqi political landscape and from Iran also had a strong element of performance to it. So there was a formal declaration of triumph from Iranians, if you read the Iranian papers, saying we through our proxies have kicked the Americans out of Iraq. Everyone knows that's not true. Nobody really believes that the United States is leaving Iraq. This was designed for several constituencies. And a significant part of it was to strengthen the hand of the Iraqi Prime Minister, Kadhimi, who is seen in Washington as someone we can do business with, someone who's not a Shiite partisan, someone who's not in the pocket of Tehran, someone who has strong connections through his previous role as head of intelligence with the American national security establishment. So someone, in short, that we can trust, but someone who doesn't have a great deal of political legitimacy of his own. He was appointed prime minister. He will face an election, possibly later this year, or if it's delayed again on account of COVID, then early next year. When he goes into that election, he will need to develop a constituency. He will need a message that he can take, a populist message to the Iraqi public, and to be able to say, I secured the exit of the Americans, might be useful politically to strengthen his position. So I think a great deal of that, the photo op that we saw in the Oval Office, that was the audience to which it was directed. Like Susan, I have a very strong Iraq connection. It was my home of 5 years, starting at the end of 2002. So I've seen the political, that landscape evolve, and I've also seen how the Iranian influence on that political stage has grown greater and greater, starting from sort of stage left and now into the center stage of Iraqi affairs. The Iraqi proxy groups, which are mostly Shiite and which are closely connected with Iran and with Iranian, the IRGC, again, were triumphant. They claim that the Biden's decision to pull the U.S. out was prompted by the hounding of American soldiers that they were responsible for. So they see it as a victory. But I am pretty certain that they too know the Americans are not really going to go anywhere. The size of the footprint will rise and fall. It's very easily replenished from bases in all across the Middle East, from Qatar, from Kuwait, from Jordan, from Turkey. It would be relatively easy to get more American combat forces into the country as and when that is necessary. In the meanwhile, if they take what appears to be a backseat role of training and guiding and sharing intelligence, then that suits everybody right now.
Gideon, I want to give you an opportunity to talk about Iraq, and then I want to shift into Afghanistan with you. I mean, on Iraq, of course, the 2003 war. Then British Prime Minister Tony Blair was very much on the forefront of that war, highly controversial in the UK, as it was indeed in the United States. But you have the sense that the Iraq war was over for Britain a long, long time ago, and that really whatever is happening there now is of interest to somewhere deep in the bowels of the Ministry of Defense and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, but really isn't part of the day-to-day conversation in the quarters of power, let alone in the public eye. Is that right? Is that sort of that's past history, and Britain has moved on?
Very much so. I mean, I think probably it did indirectly cause the end of Tony Blair's political career and makes it unthinkable for him to come back, even though people around him still mutter about that. But I think the other reason that Iraq, even more than Afghanistan, has slipped off our consciousness is that Britain suffered, considerable troop losses in Afghanistan. I think there were sort of 450 dead, which, proportionately is not that different from the numbers that the US lost in Afghanistan. We did lose people in Iraq as well, but not as many, and it wasn't over such a prolonged period. So the Afghan war, I think, has left a kind of scar and a memory that the Iraq war hasn't in quite the same way. The Iraq war is kind of remembered as this incredible controversy around the time that we went in, unlike the Afghan war, which was uncontroversial relatively going in. The Iraq war, brought millions of demonstrators onto the streets, and as I say, permanently changed the reputation of Blair, but it wasn't as long a military commitment.
Switching to Afghanistan, before we went on the air, I said that, you know, I've been in Washington and was struck talking to senior officials in various places that Afghanistan really seems to be dominating their day-to-day crisis thinking. The decision that the president made, the acceleration of it, the implementation to withdraw now the troops by the end of August, and by all practical purposes, they're gone already. The worry about what is coming next, very much both from a strategic and a moral quandary, as well as a political one, to be fair. But I think it's more the larger issue of, did we do the right thing? Is the kind of question I was hearing in Afghanistan. Gideon, you wrote your column this week on the pending tragedy in Afghanistan. It's a very tough nut to crack. But how do you look at the situation as it has evolved since the announcement in May by President Biden that the United States, and therefore our NATO allies and friends who are there, are going to leave and will be gone by the end of next month?
Yeah, well, it is quite hard to be optimistic. And I was struck reading Biden's most recent comments. He gave a little statement and a press conference just this month by how downbeat he was. I mean, he wasn't saying, you know, he didn't say peace with honor. He didn't say it's going to be fine. On the contrary, he said the Taliban are at their strongest since 2001. And he accused them of violating understandings and so on. It was not a particularly reassuring performance by Biden. I have to say, although I do think he's made a mistake, and I don't think he should have done this. I mean, you could see that this was reading what he had said. This was a man who wrestled with the strategic and the moral issues. It wasn't, you know, any argument I could put he kind of addressed, but I still think they've come out on the wrong side. I mean, although it was very interesting when I wrote that for the FT, the reaction from readers, particularly readers in America, was uniformly hostile. I mean, I think people want out. I would, you know, if our readers are anything to judge by on opinion polls or anything to judge, but I think Biden is responding to that. My argument against was that although the US and its allies and the Afghans paid a very, very heavy price over the course of 20 years, for the Americans at least, the costs have been relatively bearable compared to before over the last 5 years. I mean, there hasn't been a US soldier lost in 17 months. And even though, you know, some could argue, and indeed Biden did argue, well, that's an artificial situation because it's a product of the fact that there were peace talks going on with the Taliban. And if we'd turned around and said, oh, well, we're going to stay, actually casualties would have increased again. And that may be the case. But even if you take a 5-year perspective, before the peace talks really got going, the US had lost only, I mean, only sounds a bit blithe, 100 people. You know, it's it's not the casualty levels or even the troop levels of before. So you could argue that with relatively low casualties and a low troop numbers of only about 2,500 compared to, you know, over 100,000 at the peak, you know, the war hadn't ended, but the government was not about to fall. There was a sort of stability in Afghanistan, and the danger now is that even though the US and allied troop numbers were low, their withdrawal seems to have created a huge psychological shift in Afghanistan. I mean, the US troops and their allies the West had not been doing the fighting for a long time, other than some special ops. But I think their departure seems to have sent a signal of defeat. And talking to Afghans, you know, involved on the government side, the thing they fear most is a sort of psychological morale collapse in the army and in, you know, ruling circles in Afghanistan. And of course, it's not helped by us doing the moral thing by saying, you know, anybody who's worked for us, you've got a visa, you can get out. It doesn't exactly send a signal that we have any faith that the Taliban are not going to be back. And so that then feeds on itself. And I must say, you know, it's a minor moral footnote, but I was aware of that. You know, every article of the sort that I wrote, sort of suggesting the Taliban may take over, of course, contributes in a minor way to this potential sense of panic. which feeds on itself.
Just note, I mean, I think part of the issue is not just the 2,500 American troops. There were about 8,000 international troops and about 12,000 or so contractors, all of which is moving. So it's more significant than that. Although I agree with the point, and to some extent within the administration, debate wasn't between shall we stay a little longer or shall we leave. It really was, shall we stay for a very long time or leave? And the president decided to leave. Susan, you had mentioned also Afghanistan as an issue that you're seeing increasingly people paying attention to, and not just the interpreters, which is a hot political issue about how do you get people who helped us for 20 years out of the country before they suffer unspeakable tragedy, but also to sort of the sense that Washington is more seized with this than one would have expected, given where public opinion, I think rightly Gideon is saying, public opinion overwhelmingly thinks we should get out of Afghanistan. And yet you have this sense that people are looking at this and saying, you know, this is not just a tough political issue, it's really a tough issue.
That's right. I think this is one of those examples where you do have a big gap between sort of the world that pays attention to foreign policy across the political spectrum, which more or less has the view that Gideon expressed, that this was a mistake, that it was not necessary, in the sense that it was framed perhaps, I think, inaccurately as this sort of monumental war or peace decision, when in reality, this presence of 2,500 troops could have gone on for quite some time. It wasn't, taking a lot of casualties. It was, better reframed perhaps as a kind of forward presence in the region. They now seem to be talking about a plan in which they're going to keep those troops somehow in the, in the area and positioned to do many of the same things, but just in a more difficult, presumably more costly way, at the expense of allies and partners who have fought alongside with us for a very long time, and who relied upon, a certain security guarantee from the United States in a region that needs it. So I think that is more or less the view. I'm sure you heard it here, Ivo, on your visit. I absolutely agree with you that my assessment of the Biden administration is very similar to yours, that there's almost a haunted sense of forthcoming tragedy. And that it was also a decision that was very personal by the president. I don't think his advisors thought they could sway him from it at all. So on the one hand, it wasn't surprising in the least. I think that those who expressed surprise about it really hadn't been paying attention to Joe Biden and to, his foreign policy views. If they thought that, the flip side is, because they had a rigorous process of the kind that didn't really exist here in Washington the previous 4 years, perhaps they're even more conscious and aware of the consequences of this decision. And I have had some conversations with very senior U.S. officials who seem absolutely spooked and haunted by what they fear is coming soon. And they are, in a better position to be aware of what those consequences are than I am. And, it strikes me as an unfolding tragedy. And so I don't think the American people, the politics of it, as you said, are not likely to change. I think the assessment is, can you mitigate even any potential political damage from full-scale disaster and the collapse of the Ghani government? The answer, I think, is probably yes. My guess is that's what this pullout is designed to do, is to make sure there's no photograph of a helicopter on the roof of any damn embassy, and so that's what they're focusing on, is the optics of that. But I have to say, it turned my stomach, and I imagine everyone else in this conversation felt the same way, seeing the photographs of the Taliban leaders in China this week being hailed and at the in the same place, literally, where they're practically like slapping Wendy Sherman's face. It really, if you want to know what felt like a moment of post-American world for me, it was that image. And let's not forget what a nauseating, violent, anti-human rights in the broadest possible, sense of the word, potential government now awaits in Afghanistan. And, I know, not to overly personalize, but I will never forget. I will never forget, far more so than being in Iraq, being in Afghanistan as a young woman, 30 years old in 2001 and 2002. And, I was able to speak with the women in ways that obviously a lot of my male journalistic colleagues were not. And, there are two things I would leave you with. One is, the hands of a woman who was just my age that were like sandpaper, an illiterate woman who had never left her home, literally never left her home, who there was a whole different world of possibility. And speaking with a school teacher in Kandahar, Afghanistan, in January of 2002, literally weeks after the Taliban left their headquarters in Kandahar, having her describe to me how she taught underground school for the last few years at enormous, literally risk of her life, and thinking about, whatever happened to that woman, and what are we doing to her and to all of her children and to the girls that she taught in school. I mean, it's really, it's horrifying, and it is a huge failure of the United States. I'm not saying that it's not a failure and that Biden is correct to recognize it as such, but this is just awful stuff.
And it does sit, I mean, Susan puts it far more eloquently than I could, but it also does sit very uneasily with the emphasis on feminism of the Biden administration at home. And they've made all these statements about how women's rights are going to be at the center of their foreign policy. And this is the biggest global setback for women's rights I could imagine.
There's an interesting sort of mirror image, a sort of inverted image with what we were saying earlier about Iraq, isn't there? So in Iraq, the Biden administration is talking about of an American pullout in order to strengthen a local ally. In Afghanistan, the Biden administration is talking about a pullout, even though it risks completely destroying the government that the United States has worked so hard over so long to shore up. And it's very revealing to me how not just the regional actors like Iran, like China, as Susan mentioned, also the Russians and the Indians are now sort of trying to make their accommodations with the Taliban on the assumption that not too far in the not too distant future, the Taliban will once again be running things in Kabul, but also local actors. So in the last month or so, the Taliban has made enormous progress, gains by taking charge of larger and larger parts of the country. And it's striking to me that many of those gains are in the north of the country, the very parts of the country where previously, when the Taliban ran Afghanistan, they faced their strongest opposition. Remember, the Northern Alliance was the one that prevented Afghanistan from taking complete control of the country. The Northern Alliance was the group that the United States and its allies were able to use 20 years ago to defeat the Taliban. Those same areas where the Northern Alliance came from, those same groups of people are now making their peace with the Taliban. They recognize that not only will the Taliban take over, but they are making the calculation. This is where it's a gut punch. They're making the calculation that the world will not help them when that happens, that they will not receive the support from the international community, from the United States, from the West that they had all those years ago. So it's better to make a deal with the devil before it's too late.
It's a tough situation in this part of the world, but in some sense, what we're seeing today is something that we were likely to see at some time. I remember almost early on in this war, the Taliban would say, "You may have to watch us, but we have the time." And the question that the U.S. and its allies has always faced of how long are we staying, the Taliban said, "We're never leaving." And that reality of the conflict, the asymmetry that, by the way, we might have learned in Vietnam, which had a similar problem, just is there. And so that unless you are able to defeat that force completely and totally, which we never were able to do, you're going to have a period at some point where you have to make a calculation and a reckoning. So that's why I think that the administration actually confronted what many other administrations were unwilling to confront, that the real choice is between leaving now or staying virtually forever. It isn't a choice between leaving now and staying for a little bit, which is how the Washington debate has been characterized. And you can call it one way or the other. The administration, in some ways, finally called it in a way that no one before was willing to do. But we also are living with the consequences that we just discussed. A really tough set of issues, but that's why foreign affairs and world politics are tough sets of issues. But it is why we come together every week to try to highlight what is happening in the world, why it matters, and how we should think about it. And I think this week, Bobby Ghosh, Gideon Rachman, and Susan Glasser did that in spades. I want to thank all three of you for highlighting a really tough geopolitical situation in the Middle East and North Africa. We'll be back next week with another edition of World Review. And in the meantime, I want to wish all of you a very good weekend. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks,
Bye.
everybody.
Bye-bye, everybody.